"Get out of my kitchen. This is our space now." That's what my daughter-in-law said to me. Not shouted, said. Calm, flat, like she was telling me the weather. I was standing in my own kitchen, in the house I'd owned for 31 years, holding a cup of coffee I'd just poured from my own machine, and she was looking at me like I was the one trespassing. I didn't say anything. I just turned around, walked to the back porch, and sat down in the cold November air in my socks. That was the moment I knew. Not the moment I got angry. I'd been angry for months. That was the moment I made a decision. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. My name doesn't matter much for this story. What matters is that I'm 64 years old, I'm a retired civil engineer, and I built a good life in a mid-sized town in central Ohio. When my wife passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I kept the house because I couldn't imagine leaving it. She'd picked out every cabinet in that kitchen. The hydrangeas along the back fence were hers. I watered them every summer even though I had no idea what I was doing. My son moved back home 2 years after his mother died, when he was 33. His marriage had fallen apart. His first wife, not this one. And he needed somewhere to land. I said yes without hesitation. That's what you do. He stayed 8 months, got back on his feet, found a new apartment downtown, and moved out. We were closer after that than we'd been since he was in high school. He called me every Sunday. We watched football together on Saturdays. Things were good. Then he met her. I won't be unfair. When my son first introduced me to his girlfriend, I liked her well enough. She was sharp, put together, worked in real estate. She had strong opinions and wasn't afraid to share them, which I respect. We had a few dinners together and they went fine. They got engaged after 18 months, married in a small ceremony the following spring. I gave a toast at the reception and meant every word. I wanted him to be happy. The problem started slowly. That's how it always goes, I think. It's not one big thing you can point to. It's 100 small things that you tell yourself don't matter. She started calling the house my son and I had renovated together dated. She said the layout was inefficient. She mentioned more than once that the neighborhood was up and coming, which in real estate language means it isn't up yet. I took these as observations, not attacks. I was wrong. 14 months into their marriage, my son lost his job. The tech company he'd been with for 6 years got absorbed by a larger one, and his entire department was eliminated. He was good at what he did, project management, software implementation. But the job market was rough, and he'd gotten used to a certain salary. His savings were modest. His wife's income covered their apartment, but just barely. They came to me in March. My son did most of the talking. He said it would only be temporary. 3 months, maybe 4, just until he found something new. He looked embarrassed, asking. I told him not to be. I told him what I'd told him the first time. That's what family does. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "We really appreciate it, Dad." That was the first time she called me Dad. I remember thinking it was a nice touch. They moved in on a Saturday in early April. 2 carloads, a rented trailer, and a storage unit for the rest. My son and I set up the guest room together. It used to be his old bedroom, actually, and I'd converted it years ago, but we put the furniture back in a way that worked. It felt fine, normal even. By the end of the first week, the changes started. It was small things at first. My daughter-in-law rearranged the living room to open up the flow. She bought new throw pillows that she said updated the look. She put a basket near the front door for shoes, which she explained was cleaner. I didn't push back on any of it. She was going through a stressful time. I wanted her to feel comfortable. But comfortable, I would learn, has no ceiling. By the end of the 2nd month, she'd effectively taken over the kitchen schedule. She had a system. Certain nights were her cooking nights, certain nights were prep days, and the mornings were, according to her, hectic and required uninterrupted access. My coffee routine, which I'd had for 30 years, now had to happen before 6:30 or after 8, because that window was hers. I adjusted. She reorganized the pantry, then the hall closet. Then she moved the chairs on the back porch, because the arrangement blocked the sight lines. I started to feel like a guest who kept leaving his things in the wrong places. My son knew something was off. I could see it in his face when she'd redirect me in front of him. "Oh, we're not storing things on that shelf anymore, or that's for the recycling now, not the general trash." He'd look at the floor or suddenly find something urgent to check on his phone. He wasn't confrontational by nature, never had been, even as a kid. He was a mediator, a smoother over. He'd inherited that from his mother. I tried to talk to him privately twice. The first time he apologized and said she was under a lot of stress and she didn't mean anything by it. The second time, he said, "Dad, she's trying to make it work. Can you just give her some grace?" I said yes. I gave her grace. What I didn't do was pay enough attention to the finances. My wife and I had saved well over the years. The house was paid off, had been for 9 years. I had a decent pension from 30 years in county engineering, and my wife had a small life insurance policy that I'd kept invested after she passed. I also had a joint savings account, left over from when my son was in college, and I'd added him so he could access funds if he needed to. I'd forgotten to remove him from it after he moved out. That was my mistake, and it was a significant one. I didn't notice anything at first, because I don't obsess over my bank statements the way some people do. I check them monthly, sometimes less. But in July, 4 months after my son and daughter-in-law moved in, I sat down to pay my property taxes and something felt off. The number in my savings account was lower than I expected. Not dramatically, just enough to make me frown. I went back through the statements. Over the previous 10 weeks, there had been 12 transfers out of my savings account into an account I didn't recognize, all under $2,000 each, small enough to avoid automatic flags, totaling just over $18,000. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage. It was something colder and more specific than that. It was the feeling of realizing you've been treated like a mark, that someone in your own home, eating your food, sleeping in a bed in your house, had looked at you and seen an opportunity. I didn't say anything that night, or the next. I went to my bank the following morning and spoke with the branch manager, a steady woman named Pat, who I'd dealt with for years. She walked me through the transfers and confirmed that they'd been initiated from an authorized account, my son's, access which I'd never removed. She helped me freeze the joint account and open a new individual account that afternoon. We also reviewed my other accounts for any unusual activity. Then I called an attorney. I'd done some estate planning years ago with a firm in town. The attorney who handled my case had retired, but the firm was still operating, and they referred me to a colleague. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, asked a few clarifying questions, and then told me that what had happened constituted unauthorized use of funds, potentially criminal, depending on intent, which would need to be established. She also asked about the housing situation. "They're living there under what arrangement?" she asked. "Verbal," I said. "Temporary. No lease." "How long have they been there?" 4 months. She explained that Ohio tenancy law was relevant here. Without a written lease, they had month-to-month status as tenants by default, which meant proper notice was required before I could legally require them to vacate. But she also said that given the financial situation, there were stronger options available that could accelerate the timeline, particularly if I was willing to file a formal complaint. I told her I'd think about it. On the drive home, I passed the Kroger where my wife and I used to do the Saturday shopping together. I used to hate grocery shopping. She'd made it something I didn't mind. I thought about her for a long time, sitting in the parking lot without going in. I thought about what she would have told me to do. She wasn't a soft woman. People who didn't know her well thought she was, because she was warm and patient and never raised her voice. But she had a spine made of iron when it mattered. When my son was 17 and made a serious mistake, I won't go into details, it was her who sat him down and laid out the consequences clearly and didn't budge. I was the one who wanted to let it go. I think she would have told me not to let this go. I went home and told my son I needed to speak with him privately. He came to my study after dinner. My daughter-in-law had gone to take a call in their room. My son sat across from me, and I could tell from his posture that he already knew something was coming. He had that same look he'd had as a teenager, when he'd broken something and was waiting to be asked about it. I laid the bank statements on the desk between us. I didn't say anything. I watched him look at them. He didn't deny it. What he said, after a very long silence, was, "She said we'd pay it back. She said you had plenty and you'd never notice." I asked him if he'd authorized it. He said he hadn't specifically, that she'd asked to use the account just once for an expense, and then it had happened again, and he'd told himself he'd talk to her about it, and then he hadn't. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I did, mostly, but my voice came out harder than I intended when I said, "That is not a defense, son." He put his head in his hands. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been afraid to deal with it. He said he knew how it looked. I told him how it was, not how it looked. I told him that $18,000 had been taken from my account without my knowledge or consent, and that I had consulted an attorney, and that I was not going to pretend it hadn't happened. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I was going to give them 30 days to find other housing, that the joint account had been frozen, that I would be pursuing the return of the funds, and that how we did that, informally or through the courts, was partly up to him. He went quiet again. Then he said, "She's not going to take this well." I said, "I know. She did not take it well. She came to me the next morning while my son was in the shower. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table with the focused energy of someone who has rehearsed a conversation. She told me that she understood I was upset, but that the financial situation was more complicated than I was making it. She said the transfers were a loan, not a theft. She said that she and my son had been under enormous pressure, and that some flexibility from family would have been nice. She said, and I want to make sure I have this right, because it's important, that she and my son had been carrying a lot of the household since they'd moved in. I asked her to explain what she meant by that. She said things like groceries, cleaning, home upkeep. I pointed out that I had not asked them to buy groceries, that I had a cleaning service that came twice a month, and that the only home upkeep that had occurred on their end was rearranging furniture I hadn't asked them to rearrange. She looked at me for a moment, recalibrated, and shifted tactics. She said that kicking them out would damage my son's job search. She said it would affect their stability. She said, very deliberately, "After everything we've done for you." I thought about that kitchen comment. I thought about the shoe basket. I thought about my coffee. I told her that they had 30 days from the previous night, which made it 29 days now, and that I hoped the time would be enough. She stood up. She said something I won't repeat here because it was ugly and I don't need to hold on to it. Then she walked out of the kitchen. The following 3.5 weeks were difficult in a way that's hard to describe. We were all living in the same house, moving around each other like furniture. My son was subdued, almost spectral, present but barely. He'd gotten a phone interview with a company in Columbus and threw himself into preparing for it, partly because he needed the job, and partly, I think, because it gave him somewhere to put his attention that wasn't the situation at home. My daughter-in-law gave me the silence treatment, which suited me fine. She stopped organizing things. She stopped speaking to me unless necessary. I noticed she was on her phone constantly. Longer calls, quieter voice, going into the bedroom and closing the door. I didn't have the energy to think too hard about what that meant. I did 3 things during those weeks. First, I had a locksmith come out and assess all the exterior locks and rekey them. I told my daughter-in-law and son this was for security reasons, which was true, and that I would give them new keys the day before they were scheduled to leave. Second, I had my attorney send a formal demand letter for the return of the $18,340, outlining the basis for the claim and requesting a response within 30 days. She explained this was standard procedure and created a paper trail before any further action. Third, I called my son's older cousin, his mother's nephew, who I've stayed close with over the years, and told him what was happening. Not because I needed advice, but because I didn't want my son to have no one in his corner who actually knew what was going on. His cousin was furious on my behalf, which I appreciated, but he also reached out to my son separately and offered to help him find a sublet while he got back on his feet. That mattered to me. I didn't want my son to feel abandoned in the middle of this. I just needed him out of my house. The 30 days came. My son had gotten the Columbus job. A solid offer, better than his previous role. He was going to relocate in 6 weeks. His cousin had connected him with a colleague who had an available room in a house share near German Village. Manageable, temporary but real. My daughter-in-law had been making calls. I didn't know to whom. On day 28, she told me that she had consulted her own attorney and that she believed she had rights as an established occupant and wasn't required to leave under the timeline I'd given. I told her that my attorney had already addressed this and that the notice was legally compliant. She told me her attorney disagreed. I called my attorney that afternoon. She was not alarmed. She said she'd seen this maneuver before. Usually it goes nowhere, because the legal position isn't as strong as people hope when there's been financial misconduct and no written lease, and the occupancy period is under 6 months. She said we continue as planned and, if necessary, move to formal eviction, which in our county typically resolves within 4 to 6 weeks. I told my son privately that whatever was happening between me and his wife, his position was different. He hadn't initiated the transfers. His response when I confronted him had been honest, even if belated. The formal demand letter included his name because the account was joint, but I wasn't looking to pursue him criminally. I wanted him to know that. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry, I should have stopped it." I told him I knew. I told him that wasn't enough, but that I knew. He moved out on day 29, loaded his car, shook my hand at the door, and then hugged me for a long time without saying anything. I told him to call me when he got settled. My daughter-in-law did not leave on day 30. I wasn't surprised. We went through the formal process. My attorney filed the paperwork. The court date was set. 3 days before the hearing, her attorney sent a settlement proposal. They would vacate within 10 days, she would sign an acknowledgement of the debt, and they'd establish a repayment plan for the $18,000. I accepted. She left on a Tuesday morning. I watched from the window, not to gloat, I'm past that, but because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. She loaded a rented van with efficiency and precision and didn't look at the house when she drove away. I walked through every room that afternoon. I moved the throw pillows she'd bought to a bag for goodwill. I put the chairs back on the porch where my wife had originally placed them. I made coffee at 7:15 in the morning and drank it standing in my own kitchen without checking the time. That was almost a year ago now. The repayment agreement has held. Payments come in on the 1st of each month, consistently, which, I'll be honest, surprised me. I don't know if that's her doing, or my son's, or both. I don't ask. My son and I talk on the phone most Sundays like we used to. It took a few months to get back there. There were some conversations that were hard. He asked me once if I'd ever forgive him, and I told him that forgiveness wasn't really the issue. Trust was, and trust takes time, and we had time if he was willing to do the work. He said he was. I believe him. He and his wife are still together. That's their business. I stay out of it. He knows where the lines are now. The first time he came to visit, alone, a couple months after everything settled, we sat on that back porch and watched the sun go down over the hydrangeas. I'd done a decent job with them this year. My wife would have approved, mostly. He said, "I keep thinking about what Mum would have said about all this." I said she would have said it a lot sooner than I did. He laughed. I laughed too. A neighbour of mine, retired schoolteacher, sharp as a tack. Known her since we moved into this neighbourhood back in 1993, knocked on my door a few weeks after everything resolved. She'd seen the moving van and put together that something had happened. I told her the short version over coffee on the porch. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "You gave them a lot of grace." I said, "Too much probably." She said, "Maybe, or maybe just enough to know you tried." I've thought about that a lot. People my age, and I'll be honest with you, I've found a lot of people online who've been through versions of this same story, which is both comforting and deeply depressing. People my age are sometimes told that holding firm makes you cold. That real family forgives anything. That protecting yourself means you've failed at love or parenthood or whatever. I don't believe that. I think the most loving thing I could have done for my son was refuse to let him off the hook. I think the clearest message I could send was that what happened had real consequences, that I wasn't going to absorb it quietly and keep smiling at dinner, that he was not going to learn the lesson I needed him to learn if I made it painless. He's a grown man. He made choices that hurt me. We can still love each other and acknowledge that. My house is quiet now. Some evenings it's too quiet and I put the radio on. But it's my quiet. The chairs are where my wife put them. The coffee happens when I want it. When I walk through a room and move something, it stays where I moved it. That sounds small. I know it sounds small. After what I went through, I promise you, it is not small at all. So wherever you're listening from tonight, whether you're someone who's been in a version of this or someone who hopes they never will be, I want to ask you something. If someone told you that protecting what you built and what your life's partner helped you build made you hard-hearted, would you believe them? I wouldn't. Not anymore. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.